So thanks a lot for watching this video where I present a talk entitled Translation as Test for the Explicit-Implicit Distinction. I'm Francesca Ervas, coming from the Department of Education, Psychology and Philosophy of the University of Cagliari in Italy. Just an outline of my presentation. I will first present translation and a test for detecting meaning ambiguity, and I will try to explain why it doesn't work. Then I will present translation as a test for the distinction between semantic and pragmatic phenomena, and I will try to present the reasons why it doesn't work. And finally, we'll present my own proposal of a translation test for the distinction between explicit and implicit meaning, and I will try to draw some conclusions. So let's start from the first translation test, the translation test for detecting meaning ambiguity. It is quite a common experience for translators facing the problem of transposing what is linguistically encoded in a sentence S into a sentence S prime in another language, to be forced to choose between two or more sentences which encode in different ways the lexical meaning of the words composing the original sentence. Sometimes semantic equivalence can be maintained in translation, but sometimes it cannot. For instance, lexical ambiguity is specific to a language and is almost never preserved in another language. Translation has been presented as a test to identify lexical ambiguity, because the failure of a one-to-one translatability would prove the existence of a genuine ambiguity in the meaning encoded in the original sentence. Just to give some examples, in these cases, there is no S prime sentence in the other language which completely captures what is linguistically encoded in the original sentence S, but rather there are different sentences, sentence type A or B, or even more sometimes, encoding one or the other meaning of the original word. For instance, infer the lexical ambiguous word bank in English can be translated into Italian with banca or riva, or the Italian ambiguous word credenza can be translated into Spanish with creencia or aparador. And it's the same for the French verb voler, which could be translated into Italian with volare or rubare. However, this translation test also works for categorical ambiguity, where the same word is used in different syntactic categories as in the Italian sentence 4, where the word vecchia is a noun in A, in the translation A, while it is an adjective in the translation B. The word porta in the original sentence is a verb in translation A, while it is a noun in translation B. The word sbarra is a noun in translation A and a verb in translation B. But also in general for syntactic ambiguity, as in sentence 5, the old men and women sat on a bench, where old can be referred to both men and women or just to both, according to the translation A or B. But this translation test fails because not only ambiguous, but also polysemous words are translated by two or more alternatives in another language. Take, for instance, the example number 6, I like fish, which could be translated into Spanish, me gusta el pez, or me gusta el pescado, where pez is fish when it is alive, whether pescado is fish dead. It's of course not an ambiguous word, but it's polysemous. It can be translated into another language where these subtle differences in meaning can be found. Or in number 7, era la nipote di Borges, where nipote can be translated into French with nièce or petite fille. Or sentence number 8, la pata del perro estaba herida, where pata can be translated into English, leg or paw. Well, in Kripke's paper, Speaker's Reference, Semantic Reference, he pointed out that it's the same for the word no in English that can be translated into German with kennen or wissen, or in French in connaître and savoir, Or in Italian with conoscere and sapere. It is not surprising indeed that other languages use distinct words for these various senses of know. There is no reason for the ambiguity to be preserved in language unrelated to our own. So Kripke concluded this analysis, say that it is not uses in some pragmatic sense, but senses of a sentence which can be analyzed in this way. If the sentence is not syntactically or semantically ambiguous, it has only one analysis. To say that it has two distinct analyses is to attribute a syntactic or semantic ambiguity to it. So following Grice, Kripke distinguished between what the speaker's words mean and what the speaker meant by using those words in a given context. So for instance, in sentence like 9, she asked me where the bank is. Bank can mean different things in different contexts, but this is a matter of difference in word meaning, not in speaker's meaning, or in speaker's intention to mean. While in sentence like 10, the murderer's meat is insane, the difference between the referential and attributive use of the definite description, the murderer's meat, is in terms of speaker meaning and not in word meaning. So we should not expect to translate it into other languages, finding that the referential and attributive uses of the definite description are expressed by two separate words. So Kripke concludes that we can ask empirically whether languages are in fact found that contain distinct words expressed in the allegedly distinct senses. If no such language is found, once again, this is evidence that the unitary account of the word or phrase in question should be solved. So let's go to the second test, the translation test for the semantic pragmatic distinction. Buntolini in 2009 tried to extend Kripke's test, claiming that translation could work as a test in order to understand, among all phenomena that contribute to sentence meaning, which of them are genuinely semantic ones. In his words, any phenomenon of signification different to translation is pragmatic, while any phenomenon of signification which not only is pointed out by a difference in translation, as Kripke argues, but even forces a choice between a translation which preserves it and what which does not preserve it, is semantic. Translation should therefore the value of a test or identification criterion of a phenomenon of signification as a genuine semantic phenomenon. So translation works as a test to show that a linguistic phenomenon in the original text is genuinely semantic when it can have two or more separate analyses, which could be expressed by two or more different senses in the words of another language. Take, for instance, the case of reference assignment that forces translator to choose between alternative translation of the original sentence and a situation similar to that arising in lexical and syntactic disambiguation. For instance, the translation of the sentence in English, number 11, he thinks that it wins. When it is translated into open language, we could have two different translations. The translation A, which expresses a co-reference, and the translation B does not maintain the co-reference because the referent of the subject of thing is not the same referent of the subject of we. So open language has the appropriate linguistic resources to solve the reference assignment, while English does not have such linguistic resources. Translation works as a test also to show that a linguistic phenomenon in the original text is generally pragmatic if it cannot be eliminated by translation. So it can be preserved. Take, for instance, the case of conversational implicature, which are explicitly pragmatic. In both their generalized and particularized shapes of force, they are preserved in translation. Sentence number 12, Jada had a baby and got married, is preserved in translation into Spanish, Jada ha tenido un niño y se ha casado, into French, Jada ha un bebé e si è marié, and into Italian, Jada ha avuto un bambino e si è sposata, because and, e, e have a temporal reading in each language, meaning that Jada had a baby first and then got married. And for some Malaysian people, it's also a causal reading saying that she got married because first she had a baby. Also, Also in sentence number 13, where there's conversation between person A and B, where A asks, will Sally be at the meeting this afternoon? And B answers, car is broken, implicating that Sally will not be at the meeting that afternoon. This can be preserved in Italian translation A, and also in Spanish in translation B, because the context is preserved, and because of the characteristic non-detachability of conversational implicature. So let's see now why I think that translation does not work. Unfortunately, translation does not work as a test to distinguish between semantic and pragmatic phenomena, because many phenomena typically considered as semantic will turn out to be pragmatic, while many phenomena typically considered as pragmatic will turn out to be semantic. There is, for instance, this simple sentence number 13, the dog is black, which does not present alternative translation in Italian, il cane è nero, in French, le chien est noir, and in Spanish, el perro es negro. This sentence in 14, as with many other sentences in language, does not seem to constitute a problem in translation or presenting alternatives, forcing the translator to choose. Yet, even though it is indifferent to translation, it can be preserved in translation. It cannot be considered as pragmatic phenomenon. Indeed, not only implicatures, but also semantic intents could be preserved in translation for their characteristic non-detachability. And problems in translation seem to arise also where a cross-border phenomenon, say, between semantics and pragmatics appears in the original sentence, as in the following cases, where a metaphor in sentence number 15, and metonymy in 16, and an idiom are translated in 17. This in 15, Francesca un pezzo di pane, where the metaphor pezzo di pane can be translated into English with very lenient, or Mick has a lamp, or in French with comme de beurre. Or in number 16, where there's metonymy Hoover, we can translate it into aspirapolvere into Italian, or folletto, which was the kind of brand for the Hoover, while in Spanish the romba, say, for the classical aspiradora. And in sentence number 17, I kill two birds with one stone, and the idiom can be translated into Italian with ho ucciso due uccelli con una pietra, preserving a semantic equivalence, while ho preso due piccioni con una fava, preserving the pragmatic equivalence. Problems in translation seem to arise also in the case of implicature, which I consider is the most important fully pragmatic phenomenon. As for instance in sentence 18, where person A asks, is it superstitious? And person B answers, he never leaves home on Friday 13, implicating that he is superstitious. We could translate it into Italian, preserving a semantic equivalence. Non esce mai di casa il venerdì 13. So in that sense, we can preserve the meaning. But in this way, in Italian at least, we would lose the implicature, because venerdì 13 is not an unlucky day in Italian. In order to preserve the implicature, we should translate with non esce mai di casa il venerdì 17, which is the unlucky day in Italian. And that's the same for Spanish. We could preserve the meaning, saying that nunca él sale de casa el viernes 13. But in order to preserve the implicature in Spanish, we should translate with nunca él sale de casa el martes 13, because martes 13 is the unlucky day in Spanish. So Friday the 13th in English needs to be enriched as the unlucky day to be pragmatically equivalent to venerdì 17 in Italian, or martes 13 in Spanish, having the same role respectively in Italian and in Spanish. So according to Donnellan, arguing against Kripke, there could be also two distinct analyses in terms of uses. Also for the sentence, the mother's meat is insane. In his word, The grammatical structure of the sentence seems to me to be the same whether the description used referentially or attributive. That is, it is not syntactically ambiguous, nor does it seem at all attractive to suppose an ambiguity in the meaning of the words. It does not appear to be semantically ambiguous. Perhaps we could say that the sentence is pragmatically ambiguous. The distinction between roles that the description plays is a function of the speaker's intentions. So languages that can encode differences in the referential versus attributive use of definite description were actually found, for instance, in Northern Frisian or in ancient Greek, presenting different alternative translation for the article the in English. So let's go to another way to present the translation as a test for the explicit, implicit meaning distinction. And let's ask whether translation could bring to light a pragmatic ambiguity, as well as a syntactic or semantic ambiguity. In Recanati's view, there are several pragmatic processes, saturation, enrichment, transfer, which operate in the very constitution of what is said. Such processes generate pragmatic ambiguity that is a form of ambiguity which affects truth conditions, even though it is pragmatic in the sense of contextual rather than semantic, in the sense which ties semantics to sentence meaning. An explanation in terms of pragmatic ambiguity is no less pragmatic than an explanation in terms of implicature. So translation can offer alternative analysis of the original sentences in both the case of syntactic and semantic ambiguities, but also in the case of what is called pragmatic ambiguity, due to the pragmatic processes that will carry out the proposition expressed. In my view, the difference between the original and the alternative translation in the examples I have presented are the result of a change in the degree of explicitness in translation. Languages these different strategies used to make meaning explicit. One language may be equipped to encode very subtle nuances by means of specific linguistic devices, while another language may commonly express the equivalent nuances by linguistic devices which encode very vague semantic constraints on interpretation. When we use language, we encode semantic representation, which are partial representation of the thought we intend to communicate. In Carsten's view, this semantic representation constitutes a guide for thought that addresses must recover to achieve successful communication, recover speaker's intention. That's why there can be alternatives in translation. Before addressees recover the fully determinate thought conveyed in the original, they must engage in a process of development of the logical form, which can be represented in a different way in different languages. This forces translation to resort to pragmatic enrichment in order to derive the intended propositional form of the source sentence into the target sentence. So enrichment draws information not only from the original sense, but also from the context to go from semantic representation to fully developed propositions. And translation can be more explicit because of enrichment in both its narrowing and broadening form, because of linguistic differences between two languages, but also because of a choice of the translation on contextual grounds. The target language forced the translator to explicitly encode a meaning which was only implicit in the semantic representation of the original text. For instance, in example 18, the example on the unlucky day in different languages, that shows that this may be due to a choice of the translation on some other ground, as for instance, the cultural context, where we know was the unlucky day in our language or in another language, and its differences from the original one. Culture in this view is viewed here as a set of assumptions shared by a given community, which are widely expected to be easily accessible and retrievable by members of that community, creating a shared cognitive environment. So in a test, translation as a way to balance the explicit-implicit divide. On the one hand, the implicature of an utterance must be deducible from its explicature, together with appropriate contextual assumptions. Take, for instance, the example in sentence 18, where the implicature that he is superstition has to be deduced from the explicature of the unlucky day and that language. On the other hand, the fact that the speaker has uttered this sentence on this particular occasion must, together with appropriate contextual assumption, warrant the conclusion that she meant to convey this particular set of explicature and implicature. So there's a kind of balance between contextual assumption plus explicature that need to warrant the implicature we want to preserve in translation. We find alternative translation just in the contextual assumption plus explicature part, where we can intervene to find the right balance to preserve the implicature in the target text. See, for instance, venerdì 17 in Italian and martes 13 in Spanish. We can in some way intervene there in order to find the unlucky day in the other language in order to preserve the implicature. We might still make an implicature explicit in the target text, explaining what's the unlucky day in that language, or add it in a footnote. But it is a completely new proposition coming from a global process of the decision by the translation, rather than a local adjustment and enrichment in the text. So there are differences between global and local processes going on in translation, and that's what translation can reveal as a test. With the explicature-based development of the linguistically encoded logical form of the sentence, the mutual adjustment process between explicature and implicature precludes entire extra proposition being incorporated into the proposition expressed in order to have the pertinent, the relevant implicature warranted. Since such enrichments which have global effect are excluded, it follows that free enrichment is essentially local. It applies to sub-propositional constituents, either replacing encoded concept with inferred concept, adding material as unarticulated constituents to change interpretation of some encoded element, making them more specific, broadening its denotation, etc., to warrant the implicature of the source sentence in the target language. So just to draw some conclusion, the phenomenon of alternative translation arise when we have something linguistically encoded, but also for the level of meaning that is called explicature of what is said, the explicit meaning. There we can have alternative translation in another language. And this is due to local and mandatory processes in translation. While in the case of implicit meaning, called also implicature of what is implied, in translation, it can be preserved because it is a completely new proposition. It can be added, but it is, again, a completely new proposition, which amount to a global, sometimes optional processes. In this sense, translation and a test can be drawing this red thin line between implicit and explicit meaning. All questions and suggestions are welcome, and thanks a lot for watching this video.